Good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission meeting on mission change rulemaking. We're at like day 13 or something like that. My name is Jeff Robbins. I'm the chair of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We have with us our other commissioners, and we have 83 participants and counting zooming into our meeting this morning. The first order of business is the roll call. We would have Hearings Officer Larson undertake the roll call for us.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Gibbs.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner, Commissioner Putnam.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Okay, great. Welcome, folks, and welcome, Coloradans, to our meeting today on Zoom. We are deliberating on the 600 series rules today. We have deliberated on the 300, the 400, the 500. The way we've been doing this is we have been discussing sort of big ticket issues around the information we've received from our stakeholders around the rules that have been proposed by staff. And then we provide direction to staff. So this morning, we look to staff for its direction on what it heard from commissioners yesterday, and we may do some more issue identification this morning. We have sort of 2 buckets today that we're deliberating on. We're deliberating on the 604 setbacks bucket, and then we're deliberating on everything else bucket in 600 series. In that regard, I might ask Director Murphy to identify for us the everything else but setbacks 600 series bucket so that we can see what's on the table, and then we can also provide any additional information from commissioners around the everything else but setbacks bucket. And then we can talk about the setbacks bucket, and then we can sort of get into deliberation on all things 600. So Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to work on sharing a screen. Excellent. So this is my list of the non-setback related 600 series questions. On the ensuing 2 slides, I have a little bit more detail about some of these items, and I can flip through those if that would be helpful. Which I'll just go ahead and do. So on 602J, the question came about in the emergency management plan guidance. Should we talk about kind of what operators can do or will do to address a lack of appropriate equipment to address an emergency? 603N, do we map or require identification of nearby previous locations of wells and flow lines when a new location is being proposed? I think I can probably answer all 3 of these at a fairly high level. And then in 605, do we provide signage in languages other than English, and what does the translation space look like? And I think that might be a space where we could put together some guidance as well. The other non-setback 600 series questions, one commissioner flagged 608-10C, A10C, and 608C. I'll need a little help scoping out what that question is. Commissioners acknowledge that 614 staff has requested a little bit of time to go back and work on this issue, so I preemptively decided that staff's direction was to review Rule 614. So that might cut, I'm hoping that's where we're going on it. And then in 615, the question around do we have the appropriate sampling protocols and the correct number of samples was a question that came up from some commissioners. So those are the non-setback related questions that I've gotten over the last 15 hours, 16 hours.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I can provide some perspective. A couple of those notes were from me. The 608 A10C was a flag from industry, something along the lines of tank pressure and concern about additional testing. I might have to defer to Mr. Leonard or Mr. Minor around that. The 615, and I may have my notes wrong, there was concern around whether continuous 5-year testing throughout the life of the well was appropriate. Again, I'm not sure if that's 615, but it was the should we always test every 5 years issue. We heard testimony from some that made sense and from others that was redundant. And the 608C, I think, is the thing from La Plata County that you guys have already flagged that deserves some additional edits. There was perhaps a deletion of something. There's still an order, and there was concern that that should be still in there. So those are my additional suggestions to the non-setback slide. And the 608C, that was the La Plata County, yeah.
And it's existing rule 608C, which
Okay,
that
exactly.
helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, do we have other commissioners with additional areas of inquiry for the 600 series that do not have to deal with setbacks? Again, just trying to sort of dial in the buckets so that we can have productive discussions. And I can't see everybody since I've got a screen share. Okay, hold on. I just moved my screen over. Now I can see everybody. I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand or otherwise flagging issues in the non-setbacks arena.
Great. Do you want me to just start in on 602, 603, and 605?
That's fine with me. Commissioners, do we want to pick off low-hanging fruit and then concentrate on setbacks after we're done with that? Does that make sense? I'm seeing heads nodding up and down, which is an affirmative. So yes, Director Murphy, why don't we do that?
Great. So the question on 602J, I think that the commission has heard a lot of discussion around the interrelationship between operators, local government, emergency responders, COGCC, and then the local government itself. I think that there's a place for us to kind of provide guidance or guidelines around engaging with those local emergency responders and how to help support them. And I think that that's something that we can certainly explore in the guidance space. I'd be hesitant to tread into the financial assurance question because our financial assurance requirements are fairly rigorous. And I think that that's a question that I think this commission will be wrestling with in the future within the bounds of our authority on financial assurance. So that would be kind of a high level piece there. I can either roll through this whole slide and then talk through it, or we can go issue by issue. I'm kind of looking for the leaning forward and the hand raising to guide me, and not seeing much. I'm just going to keep going. On the second question on 603N, I think that this is a place that intersects a couple of different units within the commission itself in terms of requiring identification of nearby previous locations of wells and lines. For existing facilities, that type of information is and will come in on the 2A in terms of what are the adjacent pieces. And so I think that there is an awareness, or there will be an awareness at the OGLA level for those types of those facilities. If we then, and so that's the OGLA unit, if we then turn to the inspection unit, we don't have a specific protocol of inspecting wells and locations before a location is to be built, constructed, or proposed. I think that we have developed our inspection protocol for our field team based on a risk-based inspection program that builds in a number of different pieces of information to determine what the highest priority inspections are. And so there's that piece of it. I think then getting to the second question of, do we inspect old locations or lines? Old in this context to me implies that they're still active or still within our authority. And so yes, the age of the facility is an important component when we're talking about conducting a field inspection. As it relates to flow lines, over the course of the last 3 years, we have significantly increased our oversight and inspection of flow lines specifically. We have an entire integrity team dedicated to monitoring, auditing the information that comes into us about the integrity testing conducted by operators, which is required annually. And then on the flow lines in particular, we have required mapping requirements, but and that is a new thing that has come about courtesy of the Commission's action in November of 2019, and so the deadline to get those mapped and into our system is coming up on us quickly. And so yes, we have a great deal more information about the location of existing and active flow lines in our system than we ever had before. And so I think that we don't have a specific piece in 603N or in 609, as this commissioner has asked, that says we will do this. But I think that if you build out all of those different components, we are addressing what I would infer to be the concern in this question. In that our OGLAs are looking at existing facilities, our inspection team is looking at existing facilities, and one of the key components driving how often they're inspected is the age of the facility. And then we have an entire flow line team dedicated to looking at the mapping and looking at the integrity testing for flow lines. So that's kind of a broad stroke answer or analysis for me on 603N. And then in 605, in terms of signages and other language and translation for calls from non-English speakers, I think that this is something that we could build into kind of the community engagement best practices document that we've talked about a lot in terms of how are we responding to people who have questions about an oil and gas facility. I think the most important thing is that phone numbers are on the facility, as are the API numbers, which, as Mike Leonard alluded to, it's the API number that's most important because it's the unique identifier as compared to the actual location name that could be, Daffy Duck 23. So I think it's really using that API and the phone number that are key, and then building out expectations in the community engagement guidelines for having people available to answer calls in different languages. So that's kind of my high level analysis of those three pieces, and happy to take questions or actually like loop in the technical whizzos on these as appropriate.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I, for one, as commissioner, think that these three areas are best dealt with through guidance and through staff direction. I did have a question on 602J, and this gets back to AAG Minor's point yesterday that this applies to existing facilities. And I just, and maybe I missed it when this was presented, and I apologize, but how does that work in practice? Like, how do we, once this rule is adopted and it goes into effect on December 1st or whenever it is, what do we do to ensure that we're receiving emergency management plans for existing facilities?
Mr. Chair, if I may answer?
Yes, AAG Minor.
So the rule text was actually very carefully crafted with that in mind. So if you look at the rule, it says each operator will have a functioning emergency response plan that provides for the effective management of situations that may arise from oil and gas operations. So it is a standard requiring the operator to do something so that, and it does apply to both new and existing facilities. So operators will, if they don't already, and again, many of them do already have functioning emergency response plans in place, they would need to get that worked out. However, in terms of the actual submission of that, that is really only required for the submitting it to the commission. That's only required for new facilities because this is one of the plans that would come in on a Form 2A under Rule 304C. And if you give me a moment, I can get the full subsection. 304C8. So I hope that makes sense, that it is a standard that everyone has to comply with, but the only people who need to actually submit their plans to commission staff would be the new operators, of course, under Rule 206, which you'll hear about later today. If we get to the 200 series, staff does have the ability to request all records that an operator has on hand relevant to compliance with the Commission's rules. So if there is ever a question about whether an existing facility was complying, staff would have the ability to request that information from the operator.
Thank you for that information. Are there other commissioners with questions on or thoughts around the non-setback issues that Director Murphy has identified for us? All right, I'm not seeing any, Director Murphy, so I believe that folks are comfortable for staff to work through these issues through guidance. Great, we're seeing that you're editing on the fly as you do well.
Thanks. I've got to make notes to myself, and that's what this is. So, thank you. And with that, I'll turn to the non-setback slide 2. So we spent a little time in closing talking about the tank back pressure issue. And I think that Mr. Leonard can address that again, if that would be helpful. I think we closed the loop on the 614 and 608C question. Staff is going to go take another look at that and look at the comments from La Plata County. And then on the appropriate sampling protocols, in my estimation, we've taken the advice of Dr. Gatadas, one of our on-staff PhDs, to look at what the right protocols and what the right sampling looks like and how to build out that baseline data. And I think we've heard from some that it's entirely too rigorous and from some that it's not rigorous enough. I think that staff has used its kind of best judgment to evaluate what is the right number and what gets us the data we need to feel comfortable, or to, if we do see a concern, initiate kind of that further investigation, which is critical and really important. So that's a really high level answer to 615, and I know our team is kind of taking a look at it again and trying to organize their thoughts a bit. So if we want to dig into 615, we can, but we might need a little bit more time. I've just surprised Greg with it. So.
Sorry, unmute problems this morning. Thoughts from commissioners on the issues set forth in non-setbacks, slide number 2. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just on the water sampling piece, I thought there, and maybe we just need to have a little more discussion about, I'm really not trying to flog a dead horse, but maybe just a reminder from staff about why we think the sampling requirements that we've put forth are protective and would be timely if there were to be contamination or an effect on other folks' water sources, the up gradient versus down gradient, and why we choose 4. And I just thought there was some interesting testimony from folks, and it could be that where we have it is appropriate, but I wouldn't mind just maybe a refresher for me about why we think it's okay. And I know that Greg showed us that chart. And I know that industry doesn't like the every 5 years in perpetuity, and I'm almost wondering if the 5 years is too long in between to test and see what's going on. So I wouldn't mind just a little more discussion, but would defer to other commissioners about how they're feeling about that piece as well.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. I too would like a little refresher on that. I also would like a little refresher of the sort of cross play between sampling as well as the wellbore integrity rule set that I know goes toward protecting groundwater. And so I don't know if we've got staff available and if they're able to pivot quickly on that, or if we want to set that up for later today, but just a quick discussion about those issues I think would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. I think those are good questions. And Chair, you kind of read my mind about one of the pieces that is important to me and near and dear to my heart about what we've done with Braden Head monitoring in particular. And so we're requiring annual Braden Head monitoring throughout the state on every well, as long as there's Braden Head access. And that is kind of an initial, as Stuart described it last December, and it's just stuck in my brain so clearly, is that that's an annual well health check. And so if you're seeing changes in that Braden Head pressure, it can be an indicator of a more serious problem. And so that to me is like the most immediate source of information we have about what's happening in a well downhole. And by monitoring that, we're getting, I think, more immediate information than you would get from a groundwater sample. Because that would be, you would have to have a problem, it would have to move, it would have, and so to me that we need to, keeping in mind, as the chair said, the Braden Head and the wellbore integrity requirements is really important. And that applies to all existing wells, and that was a pretty critical component. So that to me is kind of the step one piece, and there are other pieces in wellbore integrity that Dave Andrews could talk about, but that's the most important to me. And then from there, in terms of talking about the frequency and the sampling for groundwater, I would have to turn it over to Greg or maybe Joel. I'm not quite sure who. I think Joel's the right person right now, based on the eye contact on screen, you know.
Okay, AG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while Mr. Geronlo gets ready to answer the more specific questions about whether samples should be taken up gradient, the frequency of the sampling regime, and whether 5 years is enough, and the number of wells being sampled, if 4 wells is the right number, I would just add one piece of gloss to what Director Murphy said about wellbore integrity, and why staff really does think that having this additional monitoring protocol for groundwater is important, despite the really great changes that were made in the wellbore integrity rules. And that's that wellbore integrity rules are focused on issues with the wells themselves. And certainly that is one of the main ways in which there could be a pathway to groundwater for possible contaminants, but it's not the only way. So it is also possible that a spill could happen on the surface or just below the surface. If you think about the partially buried tanks that Ms. Whittington talked about in Rule 608, that's an example where there is some existing infrastructure where you don't always see a spill if it happens. And so making sure that even though we have these great wellbore integrity standards, it's still really important to be doing the groundwater monitoring to make sure that there aren't other issues arising that aren't related to a well itself and could be related to some other types of infrastructure, is why it's really important to have these paired requirements, the Braden Head monitoring that Director Murphy talked about, as well as the groundwater monitoring in Rule 615. And so with that, I think we can turn it over to Mr. Geronlo.
Mr. Geronlo.
Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Chairman. Thank you. And I will admit that I'm, not fully prepared with an outline of all that I want to say on this matter. But a couple things just to think about. We've talked about the wellbore integrity, and that really addresses the sort of deeper aquifer issues, which our baseline groundwater sampling program is then the second tier of monitoring for those deeper aquifers. Typically, the water sources that are identified for sampling in the proposed Rule 615, former Rule 608, 609, and 318F are targeting those deeper aquifer, the Laramie Fox Hills aquifer water wells that folks are using for domestic drinking water supplies. Given the, and then, so that's the deeper end of things. And then there's the shallower end of things, where you have surface facilities and near surface oil and gas facilities, including flow lines, which certainly have a potential to leak E&P waste or produce fluids into the near surface environment, soil contamination, and potential shallow groundwater contamination. So, looking at those two sort of regimes, we do believe that the baseline groundwater monitoring program as proposed in a statewide fashion is very appropriate to provide a backstop to the to the wellbore integrity program. We've in our COENV database, which is available to the public and is a compilation of all the groundwater data that we have. We have on the order of 50,000 samples from on the order of 20,000 plus sample points throughout the state. That data goes back to as early, we have some USGS data in there from the 1940s, I think, but really for monitoring oil and gas activity, it goes back into the 90s, where we started collecting substantial amounts of data in the San Juan Basin. If you look at our COGCC online map, you can see the overlap of oil and gas wells, water wells, and then the sample locations. And we are getting pretty significant coverage throughout the active basins in Colorado. To address the near surface spills and releases, staff has proposed several additional rules to both reduce the potential for significant impacts from near surface. Lining tank batteries. I did put together a quick list of this. More stringent spill reporting, leak detection plans in the Form 2A, facility closure requirements, increased flow line integrity. All of those will reduce the likelihood of a spill happening near the surface and extending into the groundwater. It's not to say that, a flow line will never leak again, but it's saying that we will catch it timely and we will be able to then identify the impacts and minimize their potential to migrate to groundwater, or, if there is a very shallow groundwater circumstance, to, migrate off site. So we do feel that the program we have in place now is working very well. Yes, we identify spills and releases are reported, but we are monitoring those. We are, able to oversee successful remediation of those without significant, offsite migration in the vast majority of cases. To address, then the up gradient and down gradient question, anytime we have a spill or release and we have documented groundwater impacts, we require that the operator put in sufficient groundwater monitoring wells to demonstrate the groundwater gradient and the direction of contaminant migration. And we require them to define the vertical and lateral extent of contamination, both in soil and groundwater, remove the source material, and and monitor the cleanup. It generally takes, at a minimum, 3 groundwater monitoring wells to determine the gradient, so that you can triangulate the gradient. And so the sort of concept of requiring that for every site, when we have all other rules in place to prevent impacts, seems maybe excessive. So we do with the deeper aquifers, the gradient is a little harder to determine, flows much slower than near surface aquifers, and
Mr. Chair, it looks like maybe Mr. Dronlow froze for a moment, so I might just jump in and add that anyone who has additional questions about the gradient issue can also look to page 169 of the SPP, which I think also sums up some of the points that Mr. Dronlow is making right now.
Thank you for the exceptional save there, AAG Minor.
Yeah, Chair.
Director Murphy.
Thanks. So I think just to kind of zoom this back out, like the 615 is a really important component of seeing what's going on in the subsurface, but with revised permitting requirements and best management practices in 411, looking at the surface and water interrelationship at the permitting phase, I think that our goal is to really avoid them, and with good planning and best practices and secondary containment that's appropriate. I think that we've also built in a lot more protection than just 615 viewed in isolation. So
Thank you for those clarifying comments from yourself, Director Murphy, as well as AAG Minor and Mr. Dronlow. That's very helpful. Do commissioners have questions regarding this? I see Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Murphy, I don't know if you know this answer, but do you know how often situation C is coming into play where there's an inability to locate an available water source and there really isn't a good way to sample and see what's going on? Is that rare?
my instinct is yes, but let me ask the question and get back to you. Unless maybe Joel knows off the top of his head.
AAG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not know the answer off the top of our head, and like Director Murphy said, I think that's something that Mr. Dronlow and his team, John Axelson, if we are looking for other people to add to the hearing, if Mr. Dronlow is having internet issues, may also be able to answer that. I would just note that staff did review this very carefully in the course of revising the rules, and there were, I think, a few changes made to that rule and a few changes that parties suggested not made to the rule. In general, it was made clear that operators need to really do their best to get access to a well, right? That just saying like, oh, I went to the surface owner's house and they weren't home, and so I don't know who owns the well water. That is not enough under Rule 615C. There needs to be a sort of true barrier that staff can verify to actually, getting access to an available water source to do that sampling. I know that that is an issue that has caused a lack of clarity in the past that staff wanted to make sure the rule was very clear on in the current draft. But again, I can't speak to the actual frequency question.
I see that Mr. Dronlow is no longer frozen, that he may not have heard the question. Did you want to add anything in here?
Thanks, Chair. I did not actually hear the question. I kind of understand the gist of it, and I don't have statistics off the top of my head as to how many, Form 4s we receive and process for exceptions, but I can certainly get staff to look into that.
Commissioner McGowan?
I just didn't, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just in general, Mr. Dronlow, I just wanted to know if it was more of an exception and unusual than the norm where we can't find sampling locations around a well.
Mr. Dronlow?
I wouldn't say it's the normal. I would, but to say it's a 1% exception, I think would be too narrow. I think it is more than that. And so we can pull some stats for you.
Are there other questions from commissioners about the non-setback slide number 2 and the things we see on it?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Putnam.
I just wanted to address the first item on the list, the tank back pressure issue. I know there were some concerns raised by industry about overlap with Air Quality Control Commission regulations. That's not a concern that we share, that there is sometimes overlap, and agree with Mr. Leonard's comments that there's independent reason for this commission to want to ensure safety, and it relates both to safety and emissions. and is one of those areas that I think the commission's inspectors, should be looking at to ensure public safety on that point. So just wanted to flag that that's not an area of concern for us, and agree with Mr. Leonard's position on it.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. All right, Director Murphy, I'm not seeing others with additional feedback for you. Do you and staff feel that you've got what you need on these first couple of slides on non-setback issues from 600 series?
For the most part, I mean, I would put a pin in staff needs to get back to the commission about the question of the frequency of sub-C and 615. So we're working on it. I'd sent an email to staff, and we're working on pulling together that information. So
Great.
with that, are we ready for the?
Yeah, so with that, I was going to try to share my screen to help. Let me see. All right, was it successful? Can you see my screen, Director Murphy? Okay, so I wanted to sort of frame the discussion around setbacks, and this is a little cryptic, but I think if I'll talk my way through it, and I tried to share this with you, Director Murphy, so that you can add to it as we have discussion. But I sort of see four main elements to the setback discussion. And these are in an order, and then there's little numbers beside it because I'm going to suggest we take them up in the different order, such as 1, 2A, 2B, and then 3 and 3A. But I think that we need to have a discussion around the distance, obviously, with regard to setbacks. We heard a lot of differing perspectives and a lot of science that tends to support many different distances with regard to setbacks. So that is one sort of big element to the setback discussion. I think another big element to the setback discussion is the number of units. Are we looking at a setback as suggested by staff of, 1,500 to 10 or more units, or are we looking at a, every unit deserves setback? Then the third sort of element is how is setback measured? We currently setback measure from the well to the building unit. We had a lot of discussion around the thoughts that perhaps it's the edge of the well working pad surface, which is a defined term, and how that would encapsulate other things on the working pad surface that potentially deserve setback. And then we also heard testimony and evidence about, is it to the property itself? Is it to the property line? Is it to the building unit? Are there distinctions between urban and rural areas that deserve some attention when we talk about setbacks and how it is measured? And then I think the third big bucket or big talking point, and I'm happy to, and I want to open this up for commissioners to issue identify on our talking points, but the third one in my mind is the setback that we are contemplating soft or hard? And in my mind, what I mean by that is, if it's soft, then it can potentially be waivable. And then the question then becomes, under what circumstances should it be waivable? Or is it hard in that it is a outright, you shall never have a oil and gas location within the distance as measured? I'm refraining from having discussion or providing perspective on some of these pieces, but my fifth bullet there does sort of illustrate my idea of whether it should be soft or hard. In my perspective, I think our setbacks should be soft. And I think my question then becomes is, how soft should they be? And that gets to the question of, is it, soft can, so softer waivability can happen via the receptor that's being protected. So if the surface owner is within the distance and the surface owner waives that protection, that could be an element of waivability and softness. Another element of waivability or softness in my mind is the commission at hearing looks at the proposed location on a site-specific basis and is able to make a finding of sufficiently protective under 181, and therefore the setback could be waived. In that regard, the question then becomes, what is the criteria for that? And I think we heard sort of two competing elements there, or two ideas there. One is, as staff suggested, is the waivability is at a 510 hearing as part of an oil and gas development plan application, and it is, basically the commission makes a finding of protection under 181 based upon conditions of approval or best management practices or other things that they're looking at on a site-specific basis. The other, I think, thought that we have seen from stakeholders on the waivability piece is, do you go into a more formal variance process with regard to waivability? And is that process more akin to a county variance process, which is much harder to get? There's an undue hardship and it's non-economic and those other elements. And I think that staff was going to be working on the 502 variance process for us on that. My initial perspective on that is, I think that it all needs to be done. If we are going to a softer waivability, I think all of that needs to be looked at the same time on a site-specific basis around the oil and gas development plan. So that's how I at least think that the discussion needs to be framed. The little numbers beside the various buckets that I put that's my perspective on how we should go about looking through these things. I think we should start with the how many units piece. Is it protection to one or is it protection to multiple? Is it okay for 10 or for 9 or less to not have the same setback as staff has suggested, or should all instances be protected? I then think we should then be talking about distance and then how measured, and then the soft or hard question. Obviously, we also have other tangential questions such as school and high occupancy buildings, and are the numbers the same or not? How do we define high occupancy building, etc. That's how I framed the discussion in my head over the last few days. Before we get into, discussing these sorts of things, do commissioners want to weigh in more about sort of the elements or the buckets that we see before us? And I have to say that now that I'm screen sharing, I really can't see other commissioners. So I'm going to have to ask you guys to pipe up, and I'm going to scroll to see if I can find folks. I think I see Commissioner Gonzalez has unmuted. So Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think these are good buckets to really kind of frame the high level topics that we're going to discuss today. For me, I think the soft or hard question is probably one of the first ones that I'd want to tackle. And the reason behind that is because I think we need a conversation around the intent of setbacks versus the intent of alternative location analysis and how they interact with each other. The way I view setbacks is I view setbacks as pretty much hard barriers and buffers around certain receptors. And I view alternative location analysis as a buffer that requires additional scrutiny. And that's the intent there, right? It's a more scrutinized and really a more looked at, more reviewed impediment to permitting, but still along the permitting path, whereas the setbacks themselves are more kind of a hard line, a no-go, unless you have the appropriate waivers or whatever the variance triggers are that we decide here. But I really think the intent of the setbacks and the intent of the alternative location analysis needs to be reviewed in order to determine that hard or soft kind of feature of those rules, I guess. And I think that's important before we start getting into what the actual distances should be. And so that's just my 2 cents on the matter. And I wanted to share that with you, Mr. Chair, and the rest of the commission.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. Other initial thoughts from commissioners?
Commissioner Robbins?
Yeah, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think agree with Commissioner Gonzalez. It's a good place to start. I view setbacks a little bit differently, and maybe just bringing my perspective from having served on a city planning board in the past, that you have setbacks, but you often can have waivers from them based on particularized situations. And I think that's a good threshold question to get at. Are these kind of immutable distances that are absolutely necessary, or are they a very strong presumption that you should have that buffer to ensure public safety, health, welfare, et cetera? And I think a presumption probably makes sense in this case. And I'll just use examples of the kind of imperfection of setbacks as an absolute rule. We've talked a lot about some of the air-related emissions. Distance is one factor. The other factor is the emissions rate, which will depend a lot on, are they using electric equipment? Do they have a tankless system? Are they using particular water-based drilling muds? I think there are a lot of those questions that will have significant effects on the degree of emissions or odor or noise or vibration or other sort of pieces. And so, while you have a setback, I think there may be the potential to vary that in some cases. I take the point I think was raised by Western and regional local governments and others. You don't want an exception to swallow the rule. And so, I think one of the questions is, how does that variance look, or is it more of a presumption? And you can vary that based on site-specific evidence. Either way, I think you've got to have a strong case that you are providing the site-specific protection and minimization of harm as required by the statute.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam, for those thoughts. I've stopped sharing. I sent the slide over to Ms. Murphy, and we'll have her share. That way I can see everybody, and it will help facilitate the discussion here. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the comments that Commissioner Gonzalez made with respect to the relationship with ALA, alternate location analysis. And I appreciate the additional comments from Commissioner Putnam on how sometimes those harder setbacks, may need some additional thought in a case-by-case situation. But I do think that would be a great place for us to just start with the conversation. And then the only other bucket that I will propose, if other commissioners agree, is whether we need to have, and this kind of relates to the hard and soft conversation, but whether we need to have an upfront setback for riparian areas, or whether we should just have a placeholder for now, with knowing that there will be that bigger discussion in the 1200 series. But in other words, just whether there should be a category that we placehold for now and then perhaps discuss in depth later.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for flagging the riparian bucket. Do we have other commissioners that issue identify for us? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for framing it with those bullets, because I do think those are the buckets. I do think inevitably, as we're having these discussions, that these things are going to overlap one another. And so it's going to be difficult to have, to stay on track specific on those bullets individually. I think we can certainly attempt to do that, but I do think there's some bleed over, as we've already heard from other commissioners, regarding the stages and that we need to take these discussions in. Speaking to the soft or hard and what that process may look like, I am looking at it as three different things to consider. One is, the distance. One is the exception, which is different than a variance. And then one is the actual variance process. And so, I'll be wanting to talk about those three things because those are different in review processes between a variance and an exception. And so I do think those are topics that I'd be interested in talking about. And so, I would suggest just one of us diving into it at one point here and then just starting to hear from the different commissioners as far as starting with a certain bullet, but inevitably it may bleed into the other bullets.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Other commissioners with initial thoughts? All right, I'm not seeing other commissioners with initial thoughts. I guess I'll ramble a bit, but as I look at and I'm getting back to Commissioner Gonzalez's thoughts about setbacks versus the alternative location analysis. I think that I appreciated staff's approach on alternative location analysis. Maybe I appreciated it because it was similar to what I was doing under director's objective criteria, which was defining a subset of potential locations that deserved additional scrutiny for potential best management practices and COAs and whether those areas were good. As I look at the term setback, I think that it too is a tool to allow us to identify locations where the sort of presumption is, no, that's not a good place for oil and gas. Under the alternative location analysis, I'm not looking at as a presumption of that's not a good location for oil and gas, but instead it's an area that deserves additional scrutiny. So when I think about setbacks, I sort of come at it within that there's this presumption that that's probably not good, but I also believe that a workable regulatory environment for the state of Colorado should allow for that presumption to be overcome, whether it's the surface owner making a determination that they're okay with it, or whether it is this commission under a hearing making a determination that the operator has overcome that and that still is an okay place. So that's kind of my general thought. I also think that with regard to the number of units, I've been influenced by the testimony of many parties that if we are having this setback with this presumption that it ought to apply to one just as much as it applies to 10 or more. And it ought to apply to the kid that's coming home from school where they're sufficiently protective, and they should be sufficiently protective at home as well. That's my sort of initial thought about number of units. In terms of how measured, my additional, my thought is that, and I had this discussion yesterday with the West Slope folks, in more rural areas, I think we should recognize that the development patterns are kind of all across the board. And I think that it's more appropriate to have the setback to the actual receptor as opposed to the property line. In more urban areas, I think it's more appropriate to have the receptor to the property line because we can see the dense development and we know that all the lots are 100 by 100 or whatever it may be. And that way we're providing protection to the property line in urban areas. I don't know exactly how to define that, but I'm just trying to lay out sort of big ticket items on those sorts of things. With regard to Commissioner Nanjapa's bringing up the element of riparian, I think that that is entirely something that we should be talking about. But I also think that we did not hear from all parties about the issue because a number of parties sort of reserved that into the 1200 series or maybe even the 900 series. I think it is interspersed between the 600, 900, and 1200. I think we should task all parties with relitigating that or litigating that for the first time under the 8, 9, and 12. So I'm in favor of a deferral on that topic, noting that I'm sending smoke signals that that's a really important topic. It not only is important for wildlife, but it's important for water and wetlands, et cetera.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Putnam.
So I'll just kind of follow your lead here and offer some thoughts, I think, on the how many units, how measured, and riparian questions. And I know we'll get into some of the distance questions in a bit, but agree with your assessment on the number of units as I flagged, I think it was last week. At this point, when we're doing air quality and other sort of regulation on a public health basis or Superfund risk assessment, we look at any one person and the risk that one person may face rather than trying to say there's an acceptable number of people who would get a piece. We do have risk-based ones where we could say 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million based on EPA and other standards that are out there. But the number of units, I think, is an imperfect model. Certainly there could be varying number of people in that unit, different populations in that unit. You could be all kids. Some could have pregnant mothers, others wouldn't. I think it's really hard to draw those lines in a way that makes sense under 181. And I do distinguish that from pure nuisance sort of issues like light or other sort of things where sometimes you do have density-based distinctions. So I would support just having one rule on residential uses and not try to make distinctions based on units. Certainly, if there is a soft approach and there's one unit and they're the owner of the mineral estate and they waive it, I could see going in that direction. But I would remove the distinction in the original proposal between the 10 units or below. In terms of the how measured, I also agree with you on the distinctions between sizes of property. It's one thing when you have equal 1/10 of an acre lots, in a urbanized area, but even in a lot of the suburban areas of the Front Range, you have wildly different sizes of parcels, and you get strangely different answers just based on the size and shape of parcels. So I think moving towards the receptor would make sense. One question that I think we'd still have to figure out is what to do with sites that have been laid out as parcels and are zoned for residential use, but don't yet have houses on them. So we may have to look at the zoning setbacks within that jurisdiction or some other way to figure out where a home or receptor might be in that case. And then finally on the riparian question, I think we agree there's definitely value for including some form of riparian setback in terms of adding to the level of protection that we have under our water quality regulations. I think I agree with you, however, that we haven't had a chance to fully hear from everybody. And indeed, our Water Quality Control Division hasn't had a chance to fully weigh in on what would that right buffer look like or presumptive buffer look like. So I would very strongly support the concept of having those buffers, but the question of exactly what and how, I think we probably need some more process on, but also wouldn't want to delay that too long. I think it's a critical issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam, for those thoughts. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just follow up on the kind of the train of thought that both you and Commissioner Putnam have started on here. And so I do think how we measure these distances is important. I think that it makes sense. I think traditionally we've we've measured these distances from the well location to the building unit. I think it makes sense what staff has proposed as far as the measurement starting at the edge of the working pad surface. It's a defined area. It takes into consideration all the different impacts, potential impacts of that oil and gas operation on that particular working pad. And in addition, I think it adds an additional setback number that varies for sure depending on the size of the working pad, but it could be, hundreds of feet, right? And so I think that's something to take into consideration as we look at distances, and I won't go there yet, but I also think it makes sense to have the measurement go to the property line of the receptor or of the residential unit. And I do acknowledge the challenges and difficulties of that in different areas around the state, as well as different subdivisions. And so, I think one thought on that could be either a definition of a utilized property surface or a definition of a certain number of feet away from the residential unit may actually help solve some of that ambiguity that we're going to see, because I do think that, particularly in areas around the state, you've got 35-acre subdivisions all over the place. That's significantly different than, a 1/10 of an acre lot that you see in some areas. They're both residential subdivisions, but they're very different. In a lot of situations in those 35-acre subdivisions, the entire property is not necessarily a utilized piece of property. And so in a lot of those, they have a defined building envelope, right? So on a 35-acre piece, the defined building envelope may be 5 acres, but that's not going to be true of every subdivision around the state. So maybe it's a measured distance from the building unit of 100 feet or something like that may take into consideration what a building envelope may look like. And so that from a measurement standpoint, that's kind of where I'm thinking. And I do think it's important to note and to acknowledge that if we're utilizing property boundary to property boundary or some measurement that would define a property boundary from a residential unit, that does increase the total setback number from what would traditionally today be measured. And so I think that just needs to be acknowledged. I also think that that it should apply to all residences, and so I would concur with that. One residence versus 10 residents versus one high occupancy building. The protections. I think the finding is that there, is potential impacts from oil and gas operations to public health and/or public welfare, and so these setbacks should apply uniformly to all residential units. Having said that, I do think that it's important to acknowledge surface owner consent or residential owner consent in an exception process. And so I would argue that an exception process could be built into the rule that would contemplate residential owner consent, would require, and I'm understanding that this may or may not be possible, but my notes state that a real estate transfer disclosure and a full chemical utilization transparency to the consenting property owner or resident. Understanding that exception also needs to have conditions of approval that would be that would require that operation to be as protective or more protective than the original setback. I also think there's in any land use procedure, the variance process is there to address situations that weren't contemplated in the development of the regulation or the rule. And I think that there's always site-specific situations, unique and extraordinary site-specific situations that, would enable an applicant to be able to propose a variance. That doesn't mean that the variance gets approved, but it certainly creates the opportunity to propose a variance. And so that to me is different than the exception, and has a much higher bar. But I think that a variance still could be applicable to this particular setback regulation or rule. And as to the setbacks from riparian habitats, I do agree that it is an important topic and one that needs consideration and deliberation. I do also acknowledge that many parties thought that that deliberation or consideration would happen in the 1200 series, although some parties certainly brought it forward in the 600 series. I think that it makes sense to have that discussion in the 1200 series, but with an understanding and realization that that could affect and the 600 series rules as well. So I don't think it can only live in the 1200 series. It may have to also live in the 600 series, but I think that we can take that conversation during the 1200 series rulemaking deliberations. So I'll stop there for now. I've got plenty of other stuff, but I think that's enough at this point.
Well, I think we're doing a good job of trying to bite off the issues slowly and without choking ourselves. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate your comments. Commissioner Nanjapa has unmuted herself, which generally signifies she would like to say something.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Because I added that riparian consideration, I just want to acknowledge that I also fully agree that we need, our full suite of stakeholders to be able to weigh in on this. But I suppose part of my reason for bringing it forward is to see if we would perhaps agree on a placeholder, i.e. that a setback is needed, but what it is, we would decide later after deliberating in 1200. So I just wanted to add that clarification and put that out there for other commissioners to weigh in on. But related to the other discussion as well, I also agree with the elimination of the separation of the 1 unit versus multiple units for residential, and appreciate the conversation. I think I want to, maybe just continue discussing the idea of property line versus receptor and how we handle that. And I guess my initial thought is if we go to, I guess for simplification, to not necessarily have a rural versus urban separation, because I think that would be tricky to define in certain cases. Then perhaps we think about how that relates to distance. I know Commissioner Messner also noted that, and whether, just how that would affect the distance setback. But again, just wanting to note that I think defining how we separate rural versus urban, do we define it at the county level, at the acreage level, anyway, I think that could be really complicated. I think those were the major ones that we've been touching on so far. One thing that we haven't specifically touched on, and I just want to make sure that we have it out there, which may kind of relate to the soft versus hard, is the school board's role in exceptions or waivers or, whatever. I'll admit I'm still a little fuzzy with the terminology with respect to variance versus waiver versus, variance versus waiver versus exceptions, or how we're defining those things, and just wanting to make sure that I'm also clear on that as we go forward in the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Commissioner McGowan. You're still muted.
Thank you. I'm very aligned with my fellow commissioners. To piggyback onto Commissioner Nanjapa's comments, I think I'm very interested in cleaning up the school facility child care center piece. I don't see us supporting waivers from a pretty hard setback from schools, or myself. very aligned with, regardless of 1 unit or 10, we should be equally protective of all residents who are living or working in these units. I'm struggling a little bit with the setback amounts on whether it's the receptor or the property line, because I think if it's someone's home and you have kids, or like right now during COVID, a lot of us, when it's not snowing, are spending a lot of time outside in our yards. And so the property line, and I also get though that someone who has 35 acres and is outside enjoying their yard is very different from someone who's got a smaller lot and outside in their yard. So I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like, and maybe there's an elegant solution that I haven't thought of. I would be very interested in the riparian discussion, if the stakeholders could get together and put together a proposal like they did for the public water systems. I thought that was nice to see them, that they talked together and tried to work something out. And so if those folks could get together and while we have the placeholder for the riparian setback, prepping for the 1200 series, so we could have that discussion and maybe have something proposed and ready to go for us, that would be wonderful. I keep thinking about what it means to be a good neighbor. And I think that, you know, the golden rule applies: do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, but also do unto others as they would have done unto themselves, not just what we think that they want, but what it is that they want. And so I think to Commissioner Mesner's point, there are so many variables out there that we're not going to be able to think of and consider today, that I think there has to be some sort of a variance or waiver process. But as part of that process, I really want us to emphasize kind of the do no harm philosophy. So I get that someone might own their own property and they own the mineral rights, or they're willing to have a facility close to their home, or on their lot, but maybe the placement then is close to somebody else's home, or it's causing a lot of traffic in the neighborhood, or it's going to have impact on other people around them. It doesn't just impact that surface owner. And so I'm hoping that as part of the criteria that we're talking about, this variance process, that industry understands that we're looking for good neighbor behavior, that it's very revolving around community engagement, around decision making, where people feel good about the decision that has been made, and that it's protective of public health, welfare, and the environment, that we've been looking at all of these variables. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but that's kind of my thought process about what I would be looking for if we were putting together, you know, a variance for setbacks, that it would be very thoughtful about how we put it together.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for those comments. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'll address a couple of the things that are on this list other than what I had started with. So with the number of building units, I'm still evaluating that, and I'm looking forward to our deliberations on that in conjunction with the how measured. With the distance discussion. I think for the how measured discussion, I think that there should be some certainty, and I think lot lines do not give that certainty. They can change. They can be different shapes, configurations across the state. And I think that if we think about the lot line proposal and where that came from, being from the Adams County government folks, is it works for them, right? And I think that's appropriate in their local regulations. If it works for them, then they can do that. I think that when I think about certainty, and I think about homes, and I think about setbacks as they all relate to each other, setbacks should be protections against folks in and around their homes. And so by measuring from a home building, you can incorporate whatever that necessary buffer is around the home into the setback determination from a distance perspective. And so from that regard, I think that the actual home or the actual building unit is the appropriate distance to measure from for the setbacks. And again, I want to acknowledge, as the other commissioners have as well, is by expanding from the working pad surface, you're inevitably adding a significant more distance in addition to the setbacks than was previously allowed under the rules. And so with regard to those particular things, I think that's where I stand on those. I look forward to all the stakeholders having an opportunity to build consensus for riparian setbacks between now and the 1200 series deliberations that we'll get into in a couple of weeks. I think that's really important. And then I think I've got some comments on the school board waiver, and I'll reserve those until we kind of get into the more meat of those deliberations. But I appreciate Commissioner McGowan and Commissioner Nanjapa bringing those up now.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did want to clarify, if I wasn't clear as far as what I'm proposing as far as an exception goes, is not just for the surface owner, but to require, in order to be able to gain the exception, it would require written consent from all residential units within that area that is less than whatever the original setback would be. So it's not just the surface owner, it would be written consent from all residences within that area.
So if your distance is X and there are 3 homes within X, it's not just the surface owner that would receive the oil and gas facility, but it's the other 2 homes that are within X as well.
That's correct. That's my proposal. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great initial thoughts and discussions.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Commissioner.
I'm sorry, I don't know where we're moving on from this, but I wanted to throw, since we were talking about variances and waivers kind of in this last discussion, I want to throw out one more comment about, something that Commissioner Messner said about, a site-specific analysis and making sure that what we're doing is accurately and protective and minimizing adverse impacts based on the scenarios around those situations. And I just want to reiterate that I think that the alternative location analysis is absolutely the best tool. I mean, the best tool to make sure that we're protecting and minimizing adverse impacts because of the additional levels of scrutiny that apply to it. And because, it's specific to the site and we're not trying to put a fixed number on every instance. And so that's one of the reasons why I pushed, that question before, and we'll continue to push it here, is because I think that the ALA process has the potential for being very robust and very precise in terms of how we apply protections and how we actually minimize adverse impacts. So I'll leave that there as we move on into further discussion.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. I think we've done a really good job of sort of framing around some of the big issues. I think probably our next discussion is going to need to involve diving into distances, because a lot of this is all tied together, right? Like, depending upon distance is dependent upon waiver, exception, etc. I note that it's 10:21 and we had scheduled a 10:30 break. I would suggest we take our break now and then really get ready to roll up our sleeves and dive into the full setback discussion starting at 10:35. On the rest of the commissioners to re-engage. And we've got Director Murphy. All right, so we will re-engage with our 159 participants participating with us. Appreciate that level of support and the thorny task that we have before us. I think that Director Murphy, I think I sort of saw some consensus. Again, no one is hard in any of their positions because we still need to debate the more thorny issues of distances, et cetera. But I did hear some agreement I think that the majority of us thinks the measurement is, or that the number is 1. It's not like 10 plus. I think I heard that. Did you capture some of our thoughts, or do you want to sort of ground us and then we can further our discussion?
Sure. So, Chair, I did what it is that I do and tried to distill down what I heard and updated the slide that you started with. As you noted, this is all my kind of distillation of what I've heard, and the best news is this is a live document, so I will type and adjust it as appropriate. I think the piece that's easiest to say has been clearly addressed, I think, by commissioners, is a direction to staff to work on riparian setbacks as part of 800, 900, 1200. I know that a lot of the conversation around riparian setbacks has come up in 400, 600, 1200. Maybe it's a 900 issue, and so we'd ask some flexibility in terms of where we actually land the language. But I feel like I have clear direction to go work on that. So if we're good with that, we'll just put it in a bucket and be done with it for today. On the other pieces, we didn't talk much about distance, so I don't have anything there. I sensed general agreement around 1, recognizing that the distance might play into further conversation around that. The how measured question is complicated, and the sidebar conversation that staff is having is how do we actually do that and what does it look like? And so, calls for something that provides certainty and is easy to, not easy to implement, that's not the right word, but is straightforward to implement. And that's where some of the parcel size can be complicated because it's going to depend on the tax assessor's office and how does that come in and how do we use it. Whereas using, an image to measure distances, again, is just, it's a more straightforward calculation. So those are some pieces to think about there. On the soft, not hard, the variance exception waiver, I have one piece that I heard, which is not wanting school boards to be put in the place of waiving it. I think that fourth bullet point is probably the one that needs a lot more exploration based on the overall concept of variance waiver exception needs a lot more exploration from the commission. But I felt like the directive of not letting a school board waive it was clear. So.
Thank you for your continuous good work in summarizing our disparate thoughts into a paper that can help give us direction on these issues. All right, well, at this point, and I'm gonna, unless others, I'll sort of speak my mind on distance. And I want to sort of take us back a bit. First, the mission of the commission under 181 did indeed change. We changed from a regulatory agency that fostered oil and gas development, taking into consideration cost effectiveness and technical feasibility. And we're now a mission that is, we will regulate in a reasonable manner, in a manner that is protective. And I think that's important. And I think that frames our discussion. I also want to echo back to AAG Minor's discussion of the deference that is accorded this decision-making body. The doctrine of Chevron deference means that because of the inherent challenges in weighing complex scientific evidence, our judicial system will defer to the decision that we reach so long as it is rooted in a reasonable interpretation of that evidence. So I really appreciated AAG Minor's more thorough explanation of that. I think all agencies should have that in mind as they are weighing complex scientific evidence. I then look at the evidence that we've seen as being indeed that, complex scientific evidence. And I look at what we've received from the various parties. Industry first argued that we should just defer to local governments. Then its scientist, Dr. McMullen, did very well to argue that we should maintain the current setback, which she believed to be 500 feet to buildings. However, Mr. Ranello corrected this misinterpretation by noting for the record that indeed the current hard setback is 200 feet from a well. And in certain instances, of lots where there's a lot of buildings around them and an urban mitigation area, the setback is 500 feet. Industry lawyers tended to support staff's draft of a 500-foot to one building unit, and there was some support from industry of a 1,500 to 10 or more, provided there was clear and achievable waiver language. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we had others that were arguing for much greater distances. Colorado Rising argued for a 2,500 from the edge of the well pad surface. The Allied Local Government Group argued for 2,000 feet to the building unit, but note that the building unit are surrounded by more than one oil and gas facility, so kind of take a look at the proximity of everything. They also noted that that should play at the state, because there are often times where one local government cites something in proximity to another local government, and that other local government's setbacks are not protective or can't be recognized. Adams County goes 2,000 feet to schools and 1,000 feet to building units, all measured from the edge of the well pad surface and the property line of the building unit. Sierra Club's Earthworks logic suggested that it's a 2,500 to the building unit and a half mile or 2,640 to the school and childcare, all measured from the edge of the working pad surface to the school property line. And they, I think, did a good job of having scientific studies and articulation with their witnesses for the justification for that 2,500 and that half mile setback. Conservation Colorado suggested 2,000 to one unit and 2,500 if there are 20 plus wells using the working pad surface. They both Sierra Club, Earthworks Logic, and Conservation Colorado all suggested that the setbacks should be waivable. Looking at the science, again, I think Commissioner Messner did a great job of asking scientists from all perspectives, how can you guys come to such varying conclusions? You know, and I recognize that as well, which I think is why the US Supreme Court in Chevron has provided deference to this agency as we look at the various scientific studies. I do find credence in the CDPHE study. It does find that there can be exceedances to the health guideline values up to 2,000 feet, and that those acute exposures can be associated with headaches, nosebleeds, fatigue, dizziness, depending upon the chemical, the intensity of exposure, and the sensitivity of the individual. And what really harkens home for me is that science and what CDPHE said the complaints should be line up precisely with what the complaints have been. If we look at our complaint logs at CDPHE and at COGCC, and there's evidence in the record, I think some of the environmental groups have this evidence, but 60% of the health concerns reported to the Oil and Gas Health Information Response Program had these kinds of complaints. More than 750 reported health concerns that included these short-term health effects. And what really drives it home for me is the testimony from people that have presented to us, that have taken time out of their schedules. The Dr. Speaces of the world, the Miss Butterfields of the world, the neighbors at the Anthem Ranch. These folks that have complained about the same things that the CDPHE said those complaints would be. I also look at our statement and basis and purpose that our staff put together. And they put together, I think, a very eloquent, thoughtful, reasonable, science-based statement and basis of purpose for a 2,000-foot setback to schools. And they also noted in the statement and basis that from a nuisance perspective, at 2,000 feet, noise dissipates to the point where it is no longer disruptive. They also, in the statement, basis, and purpose, said at 2,000 feet, there are more protections relative to traffic, dust, odor, light. And then I also tend to agree with Conservation Colorado's points regarding safety. 2,000 feet is obviously safer than the 200 or the 500 foot that we have now. And then I applaud staff in the statement and basis, but I do take one exception, and this is not meant to belittle staff. They have done an amazing, amazing amount of work. But when they spoke to the justification for the setback of 1,500 to 10 or more, there was a note that that had been determined to be workable for all parties. And I don't believe that 181 is informing us that we are to create a setback that is workable for all parties. Rather, I think we're tasked with making a setback and a regulatory regime that is protective. And so where I land is that we should have a setback that is 2,000 feet to one or more building units. I think that it should be measured from the edge of the well pad surface, but I agree with Commissioner Gonzalez that with regard to the other measurement, that it should be to the building unit. I think that adds in a little additional protection. It adds in protection around all the things on the well pad surface, but it also adds some certainty to where buildings are located. And then importantly, I think that the setback should indeed be waivable. I agree with Commissioner Messner that it should be waivable from anyone that is within that setback, provided they all agree, not just the surface owner. I agree that this setback should also be equally applicable to schools, and that goes to the school property line. And I do not believe that school boards are the appropriate entity to make determinations of waivability, but I do think that the commission could make determinations of waivability. And I guess that's sort of my last point, is that we should take advantage of the fact that we 5 members of this professional commission, we should be looking at each and every location that is within 2,000 feet of a building unit or more. We're here, we're working every day. We have the capacity to take these looks. So I think that we should have a provision within the 2,000 foot to 1+ building unit that is waivable. And that's waivable after a 510 hearing, based upon the commission making a finding that the location, even if it's within that setback, that it's protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife sources. I think the burden of proof for that potential waiver goes to the operator who's asking for it. And I think this is sending a clear signal that we are creating a protective regime under 181. I think I'll stop there. And I appreciate commissioners letting me sort of walk through my thought process about where we were, where we are, and where we're going. With that, I would look to other commissioners for thoughts. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that, having the courage to start that discussion. And I appreciate your thoughts and your rationale. As I look at my notes, I think we are very similar in our analysis. I think what we've heard over the course of the last, well, I don't even know how many days now, but it is also clear to me what the directive of SB 19-181 is. And I do believe that the science of the CDPHE study and the data and testimony and public comment that I've heard over the last 18 months clearly indicates significant correlation between some of the findings and conclusions determined in the CDPHE study and what I was hearing as a commissioner, both on the volunteer commission as well as my role today. I think from a measurement standpoint, I had initially in my mind thought it would go from the working pad surface to the property line. And I actually have been arguing with myself about how that would be possible. My number was 1,500 feet, but I was going to the property line, understanding that if we went to the building unit that at 2,000 feet, that I think that covers, it's going to be substantially similar to what I was proposing anyway. And so I'm comfortable with your thoughts on the 2,000 foot setback. I've also proposed the exceptions, and I do want to be clear as far as what my conclusions were there on the exception. And when I say exception, I mean that the exception would not require a hearing. It would be an allowance of an exception to the rule, assuming that anyone within that 2,000 foot setback, any residents within that 2,000 foot setback would give consent, and all of them would have to give consent. I'm suggesting that consent, in order to provide that consent, that there needs to be a full disclosure on the chemicals utilized in the operations. And I know this gets a little bit awkward, but what I'm trying to get at there is that when someone is offering consent, they need to understand what they're offering consent to. In order to be able to understand what they're offering consent to, they need full transparency as to what the potential impacts of that operation could be on them. And I have in my notes, and I don't think this is within our jurisdiction, but I do think it is important, just for future note, that future owners of these properties that are within this setback need to know that they're within this setback. And that's where I'm coming up with this real estate transfer disclosure. And so what I want folks to know is if they're going to purchase a house 15 years from now, and that the existing owner of that house has provided consent to be within this 2,000 foot setback, that they know that. And so I'm not sure how that gets accomplished at some point in the future, but I do understand that may not be possible in this rulemaking. And I also think it's really important in that exception, and I think it's inherent in our regulatory process and in our mission that we are protective and that we apply protections to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. But I think within that exception, it needs to also be clear that the exception must be as protective or more protective than the original setback. And as far as the schools go, I do agree that the 2,000 foot setback also should apply to schools. I think for schools, it's clear to me that it should go to the school boundary property line, and that the school board should not be the entity to be able to provide a waiver of that setback to the school. Now, as far as utilization of the 502 variance process or 510 hearing process to consider additional waivers beyond this exception that I'm proposing, I can be talked into either one. I think that the important thing is that because this exception is in place, that the additional variances or waivers need to be held to a higher bar. And so I'd be curious to hear other commissioners' thoughts on whether that's best accomplished through the 502 waiver process or variance process or through the 510 hearing process, but I'm not set on one or the other in that particular situation.
Commissioner Messner, I have a follow-up question for you, if I could, just so I can make sure that we all understand your position. With this exception piece, this is the people within the area have signed a waiver, basically, and all of them have signed that waiver, I think is number one. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then number two, you mentioned that the exception did not require a hearing. But you also suggested in your mind that the exception still needs to be as protective.
And when I say that by the hearing, I mean, it would still have to go through, because it's still going to be, go through the oil and gas development plan process, right? So, I mean, it will get that hearing. And so I don't mean that,
Okay.
you know, it doesn't have to go through a 2A process or an ALA or anything like that. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting, it doesn't need an independent hearing just for that exception, but that would be part of the regular oil and gas development plan application hearing.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
Other commissioners who desire to weigh in at this point? Commissioner Gonzalez. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So I want to come back and make sure that we're all looking at this through the same lens in terms of the directive that was given to us through SB 181, which is to protect and minimize in a reasonable and necessary way. When I think about that, I think about the testimony we've heard today from a lot, or not today, but over the last couple of weeks, and through the public comment we've heard leading up to this rulemaking hearing. And we've heard a lot of real impacts to real people. And I think that's impactful to me, and it's compelling. When it comes to the setback distances, though, I don't know that I've been compelled by the science that supports a 2,000-foot setback. I just don't know that the science is there. It seems anecdotal to me. It seems like it has been refuted pretty thoroughly and in a pretty compelling way on both sides. And I'm not saying I agree with the other side as well. And in fact, I don't know that a 500-foot setback as proposed by Dr. Kane or Dr. McMullen is or isn't protective. But what I'm concerned with is 2,000 feet necessary to protect and minimize adverse impacts as a hard setback. And that's why I keep on coming back to this alternative location analysis, because I do think that the best way to protect and minimize against adverse impacts is through a thoughtful analysis of the siting of the well pad within defined buffers around public receptors. And I think that when you consider that on a site-by-site basis, you have the opportunity to do that through the alternative location analysis. And it's going to make any operator wanting to operate within a prescribed distance have to show their work, have to show that this is protective and does minimize adverse impacts. And we do it on a site-by-site basis. And so whatever those distances end up being, I would suggest that an alternative location analysis, has the opportunity to go before a full commission, or if it doesn't, then it has the opportunity to go through a consent agenda if there's no objections. And for setbacks, I would say that hurdle should be higher. I would say that the setback number should be lower than an alternative location analysis, and if the threshold for overcoming a setback variance or request for a setback variance should be a higher hurdle. And so what I would propose is that maybe we increase all the alternative location analysis footages to the 2,000 feet that Chair Robbins has suggested, and require an alternative location analysis for every one of those that would be within 2,000 feet of the public receptors identified in 304B, and that the setback number stays closer to kind of a no-go zone. And I don't know what that footage is, right? I don't know that 500 feet is the right number, but I don't think 2,000 feet is the right number. And when you have that no-go zone, anything below that would require a full commission hearing. I have concerns based on the study that Mines put out, the School of Mines put out, that at 1,867 feet, that basically there's no room for horizontal development in the basin, in the DJ basin at least, per their analysis. And so if you go above that to 2,000 feet, then I would anticipate you're looking at a hearing and a setback variance for every horizontal well pad in the DJ basin, of which there's many. And I would think that you're looking at that on even more of a prevalent or even a higher volume out in places like Garfield County, where they're drilling directional wells that are even more impacted by a 2,000-foot setback than just the horizontal wells, going back to that same study. And so I'd worry about the volume of variances where we're hearing a variance on a vast majority of the permits on the most productive oil and gas basins and fields that are currently being operated here in Colorado. And so I have concerns with that 2,000-foot setback, and as it currently stands, I don't agree that that's the right number and the right way of going about it. I think there should be distinct processes and impacts between the alternative location analysis and setbacks. I think they should be handled differently. I think the numbers should be different. And I think we should consider the best way to protect and minimize adverse impacts in a reasonable and necessary way.
Thank you. Commissioner Gonzalez? Commissioner McGowan?
Sorry, I'm having arguments with my mute button today. So I'm really appreciative of everyone's thoughtfulness of how we're trying to tackle this. I think from a public health perspective, and not just because I'm a former CDPHE employee, I put a lot of weight into the study. It's the first time that we've taken actual air monitoring data and put it into a model. And it does show that there are acute health effects up to 2,000 feet for people living within oil and gas operations. And, you know, any of us who are out in our yards this weekend and had ash falling on our porches and weren't living near the fires know that things travel in the air. And so I think we need to use the data we have available now, and I know that it will continue to get better and better. I think we're going to continue to collect better data about what is protective for public health. What I see in front of us now, I feel comfortable with a 2,000-foot setback. That being said, I'm also very interested in making sure that we have some sort of an off-ramp, a responsible off-ramp that's protective of public health and the environment and welfare, that allows operators to obviously continue to do their business. And I'm wondering for places like Garfield, if a comprehensive area plan is designed then to deal with the fact that we don't want 100 different variances coming to the commission. We would want someone to look thoughtfully at an entire geographic area and say, this is how development should occur in this place. And here's the special circumstances that we had, and here's what we're trying to do to tackle it. So I'll stop there with those thoughts.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner Nanchapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the commentary so far. As Commissioner McGowan said, I just really appreciate the thoughtful discussion here. I initially had a thought about a 1,500-foot setback, but from the property line. But given that we've been talking about some of these different challenges in different environments, I am kind of rethinking that a little bit and thinking that the 2,000-foot distance would help address that. If we're going to the building, from the edge of the well pad to the building unit. I was also very compelled by the testimony from the people who were directly impacted. While I agree there were some compelling cases made with respect to the health studies and the health impacts of certain, with respect to the distances proposed and not exceeding 500 feet from some of the testimony from Dr. McMullen and Dr. Caden and others, there was, limitation on what they looked at in terms of, what was the impact on health, what chemicals they looked at. There was also all the other factors that we've heard in the nuisance issues, noise, the vibration, et cetera. And so in my mind, 500 feet is more of the bare minimum. And I feel that if we want to be truly protective, we have to go beyond that. I'm interested in what Commissioner Gonzalez raised with respect to the alternate location analysis and having a greater distance there. And I guess I would like to continue discussing and exploring that. But I'm definitely not in support of 500 feet in any case. I think it needs to be greater than that based on the testimony we heard, the evidence that was presented with respect to especially the nuisance issues. And I think in some ways, given that there weren't, spikes in the emissions or the chemicals that were detected over a long period of time, but the noise is often continuous, or the light or the dust or the et cetera. And I think those are the kinds of things that are compelling to me and also result in issues that contribute to public health. But on top of that, the public health issues that have been observed that may be attributable to some of these chemicals, that can potentially change a person's life forever. And that's really compelling to me, that we need to be far beyond whatever the bare minimum is. And so that's where I stand on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Do our non-voting ex officio members desire to weigh in? Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you everybody for this really thoughtful discussion. I think agree with the approach. In fact, don't just think it, I do agree with the approach, Chairman Robbins, that you laid out, and Commissioners Messner and Nanjapa and McGowan, I think have kind of added onto. And just wanted to flag from CDPHE's perspective, kind of how we see the kind of state of the evidence and the state of the decision in front of the commission right now. And it's really a combination of two things. I think one is the kind of scientific evidence and testimony and other information that we received, and then also the critical presumption that 181 made in this case, that we need to start with the presumption of public health, environmental protection, safety, et cetera, and that has changed, I think, the assessment. And while I would agree, and I think our technical folks agree with some of the industry folks, Dr. McMullen, Dr. Caden, on a number of the scientific points, I think we disagree on, the ultimate punchline of that, which is a policy decision, and would, suggest everybody hearken back to Dr. Richardson's last slide from last week, where she kind of talked about that overlap between purely scientific questions and then policy questions. I think the question of what's necessary and reasonable, those are policy decisions that are informed by the science, which I think, going back to A.G. Miner's original point, some of the points you've made, Chairman Robbins, and that Dr. Richardson made, the science is not perfect in that area. We don't have all the information we wish we had. We have a lot more than we did. We don't have as much as we will in the future. But we have a task to perform under Senate Bill 181 and need to move forward with that. The other thing, before going into some of the specifics, especially related to health issues, is really to point out that it really needs to be the cumulative package of impacts and not any one point. The effects that people have are not just air emissions related health effects, or just noise, or just light. It's the kind of accumulation of all those pieces. And I think that's reflected in some of the complaints, the actual experiences that people have had. And I think, going back to some of the points that Dr. Richardson had made and were flagged in the health study itself, that study was not able to capture the kind of full cumulative effect that people have. And there are physiological effects of living under stress that, should be considered here. And, the fear about safety issues, the vibrations that you feel during development, all those other sort of things are part of the overall package that needs to be considered here. So going to the actual science related to health effects, I believe that the scientific evidence that you've all heard provides the basis to move past 500 feet and support the full range that's been discussed. Also believe that the CDPHE study, despite its limitations, which were well documented in the study and well documented by Dr. Richardson, is still probably the best evidence out there, kind of capturing the full range of potential impacts. Would agree with Dr. McMullen. In a perfect world, we would have monitoring at every well for 365 days a year for 360 degrees around a site. We don't have that. We have a good and growing body of information, but we don't have complete information on a site-specific basis. And so the CDPHE study is the best, I think, way that we have to fill in those holes and inform by actual emissions measurements. I would take issue, I think, with Dr. McMullen's characterization that either the study itself or Dr. Richardson characterized it as overly conservative. I think we would agree that it is very conservative in the screening sort of way that she identified. Would also agree that the study shows that this is not something that's happening every day at every location around these wells. It does show that it's infrequent, and it's really focused on some of those short-term acute effects, especially during the development process for those wells. That being said, that does not necessarily mean it's not a reason to make a policy decision based on that. I think the policy decision on you is, if something is infrequent, is it still reason to have that setback in the same way that we can have a violation of ozone standards or particulate matter standards based on a small number of hours of the year in a small part of the Denver area, for example, and still trigger significant consequences that we believe are worth protecting for public health purposes. I think the public policy call that this commission needs to make is, is that imposition on people's health, that imposition on people's lives, worth providing that protection. And I think that evidence is there. Also want to note that while there are conservative parts of the CDPHE study, for example, we still would like to get better emissions rate information using the kind of current practices and forward-looking practices that are becoming cleaner. And I think on a well-by-well basis, they are getting better, they are getting cleaner. That being said, the study didn't consider multiple well pads in a particular area, didn't consider all of the effects. And so, it's a work in progress, and there's both conservative and lack of conservative assumptions in there that, call for more work, but still provide information that's actionable. Going to some points about actual data that are out there right now. I'll note that while we have collected thousands of hours of sampling with our mobile monitoring lab over the last few years, there's 8,000 hours in a year and 360 degrees around a well. We've only captured a fraction of that at this point. And while I think we're getting higher degree of confidence about some of the long-term effects, we still see some of the short-term effects. And even with the better technology, the better approaches, two of the highest levels that we've seen, one from our sampling around the bedding pad near the Bella Romero Academy, and the other that Dr. Collette has seen at the Livingston pad, happened in the last year. So, we haven't addressed all of those issues. There's still work to be done to reduce emissions. We've also seen some information from the University of Wyoming and CSU about instantaneous spikes near produced water facilities. So, there's still work to be done there, and I think there's still a scientific basis. A few other pieces, and then I'll put it down, but happy to engage in conversation or discussion. I think there was a fair amount of discussion about the 2017 CDPHE study, which looked at a great deal of information, both in the literature as well as studies that are out there. I want to note some of the limitations that CDPHE document noted at the time, that while there's strong information out there, it may not be fully representative of actual exposures that people have. That's what the current 2019 CDPHE study tried to address. And while there was pretty good agreement on long-term and chronic effects, there was less confidence in the short-term effects, which again was the focus of the 2019 study, and a lot of the efforts that we have right now. So, while it was an important piece of information and helps guide us, it wasn't the final answer. Similarly, some of the industry and other sort of data that's been collected, including some of the data that were identified by Dr. McMullen, again, help fill in some of those pieces, but we're still talking about a small fraction, both of the geographic coverage and temporal coverage, and we still see some. They are infrequent, and they may not be the most serious, such as cancer, but they're still relevant and still important from a public health perspective, and consistent, I think, as you pointed out, Chair Robbins, with some of the complaint and other information that we collect at CDPHE, that you collect at COGCC, and that was referenced in some of the testimony, including there in Broomfield. So with that, I'm happy to go back and discuss any of those issues. Did want to flag a couple other points related to some of the conversation about how this will work. If there is going to be a soft, setback and some potential waiver process, in addition to property ownership, I think we need to be very careful about how we make sure that tenants are heard here. I think from a perspective of environmental justice, a lot of the people who have less power, less voice, are often in rental housing. And we need to make sure that they are well represented and well considered in any process moving forward. I think with the capacity of this full commission, that's going to be possible, but I think it's an essential conversation to have. Also think we should have a conversation about some of the points raised, again, I think by the Western and rural local governments, about the kind of reverse question: how does a 2,000-foot setback or 1,500-foot setback from the well pad affect the land use decisions that they're making, and how that affects availability of housing? I do think there are some distinctions that could be made between the development phase, or the pre-production phase, and the production phase. A lot of the biggest impacts that we've seen and talked about, really come in that pre-production phase, where you've got drilling rigs and flow back, more noise, more dust, more other sort of issues. But I think it's important to consider, along with the points that Commissioner Gonzalez raised, and I think Commissioner Messner to some extent, about how we deal with the spacing issues. I think Commissioner McGowan was onto something that, a kind of comprehensive planning is the answer to a lot of these questions. And the more we can steer things in that direction, both will have better results as well as better process. I think we see that in general land use. Making lots of individual decisions doesn't necessarily result in the best decision. Comprehensive planning leads to better decisions. So, thinking of this holistically, I think that may be part of the answer. I'll set the mic down there, but happy to follow up on any questions or points that people may have.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Gibbs, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to provide perspective, weigh in?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the very thoughtful comments of my fellow commissioners. And I think you all have summarized some of these challenges quite well. But I'd say, given the directive that we've been given through Senate Bill 181, taking I'd say more of a protective stance of 2,000 feet, make a lot of sense to me. but I also think we should offer that flexibility to look at specific site, concerns and locations through, a waiver or exception or some other type of hearing that we could look at, additional flexibility. Very similar to, when I was a county commissioner and we had land use decisions that we were looking at, wastewater facility of how close you'd be to a house. There were some opportunities for some flexibility. So I think the majority of us are on the right track with again 2,000 feet, but offering some of that kind of a soft flexibility to look at a variance or exception. The one question or concern I have with looking at a variance process of what happens if you live in a particular location and you're renting a house but you're not the owner of the house, and you really have concerns of a location of oil and gas potentially right outside your doorstep. How do we take that into account? Is it just the owner of a house, or would it be the folks that are actually living there? So I think that's something we would have to figure out the details on.
Thank you, Commissioner Gibbs. And I think that was also something that Commissioner Putnam was speaking to relative to the tenants piece of this. I appreciate the discussion that we've heard from all 7 commissioners, the 5 voting, the 2 non-voting. At this point, I'd like to address, a couple of the points that were made, and sort of the impact, the point that Commissioner Gonzalez raised if we are at 2,000. My perspective again is the 2,000 is necessary as a setback, but that we should build off ramp or ramps plural to allow for an operator to come to this professional commission and seek something that's closer. But I think that the setback is establishing sort of the parameters that generally we think that is, the presumption is that's not protective, but we do want to build in off ramps to allow in cases where after consideration at hearing, we can make, potentially make a finding that the operator met its burden of proof that it can be located closer, and here's why, or here's the conditions of approval or the best management practices that will ensure the protective nature. So that's one. 2, my off-ramp in that regard also wants to fully take into account the local government review that may have already occurred. And so I would take up the Western Rural Local Government suggestion for 301F, that we early on engage in a thoughtful and meaningful manner with the local government. I'm not sure if that's staff, I'm not sure if that's commissioner, I'm not sure if that's both, but for those local government that ask us to come to the table when they're doing their permitting with an operator before we're doing our permitting, I think we ought to agree and take them up on that and go to that table. I think that early on, and I think we should agree that if the local government wants us to be a referral agency, we should take them up on that. I think that this early on collaboration, showing up at a pre-app conference, even if it's in a location that's less than 2,000 feet, would be able to inform the local government and the operator of our technical concerns that may exist. And then as the local government goes through that process and an operator receives an approval, if they want to come to us and using the setback off-ramp, see if they can get approval, we'll have that local record that has already been informed and developed so that we can bring the local perspective to our table as we're doing our deliberation. I think yesterday, I think there was concern about, I had some questions for Garfield County, and I wasn't trying to be uncollaborative. I am probably to a fault, a collaborative individual. And I think that we should collaborate with our local governments. But I think that collaboration needs to certainly be a two-way street. we do have a new mission that is we have to regulate in a manner that's protective, in a reasonable and necessary manner that's protective of public health, safety, welfare, and the environment and wildlife resources. And I think that's what we're doing as we're debating all of the rules that we're developing. And so while we've had a lot of calls for local governments that we should defer or we should, be involved, they need to understand that we still have our job. I mean, as we all said, I think on day 3 or 4, the buck stops here in terms of a protective regulatory environment. But I don't think, and I appreciate Mr. Lepore reminding us several times that the local government is supposed to regulate with a similar mandate in a reasonable manner that allows for protective. I noted yesterday that Garfield County doesn't have regulations and that they're going to get in the regulatory game. That's fine and that's fair. And I think that we can create processes that work for all, where we can be collaborative. So I guess to put a point on it, I would build into the off-ramp that we should take advantage of what the operator may have done with the local government. We should, at 301F, engage ourselves at the local government so that we are early on issue identifying where there may be the potential for issues. I also want to recognize that, the place that I land today is not necessarily the place that we should always be. I, for one, would suggest to my fellow commissioners that we should be engaged in the development of science. We are a full-time, 5-member full-time paid commission. We've got a partner agency at CDPHE, and we have, I think, historically been a reactive agency in terms of reacting to other work that may be done, may being occurred. And I think we should take the bull by the horns and engage in that science. We tried to do that right after the CDPHE study was announced. And we started working with CDPHE, and Greg Geronimo was doing great work there in terms of putting together sampling around facilities during pre-production. And COVID-19 sort of struck, and we also had this rulemaking that was taking all of our attention of staff, et cetera. And so that has not developed as much as we would have liked it to, but I think we should pledge to continue to further develop that as well. So I think those are my sort of response thoughts to the thoughtful and productive thoughts that I've heard from my fellow commissioners. I would turn to other commissioners if others have other response thoughts now that we've all started to sort of hear from others. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm having a hard time reconciling the necessity of a setback and the concept of an off-ramp that goes contrary to that necessity, right? We're talking about necessary here, and I think that was the word that you used, Mr. Chair. And so my question is if 2,000 feet is necessary to protect in all instances enough to have a setback, then why would it ever be waived?
Well, so let me address that. So in your second opening this morning, I think you've spoken 3 times now, but in the second time you spoke, you said, is 2,000 necessary as a hard setback? And that's not where I'm going, at least. I'm saying 2,000 is necessary as a soft setback. And I'm saying that I believe that if an operator should be placed on notice that, generally speaking, 2,000 is not protective. But I'm also saying that we should develop through waiver or variance or some method that the operator still has the opportunity to, on a site-specific basis, convince us, the decision maker, that it can be less than 2,000 based upon some specific circumstances that exist for a particular operation. But I think it also is setting the stage for Colorado that generally you ought to try to develop mineral resources away, 2,000 feet away from building units. But it's also saying that that's not hard. So that's how I define setback and define what we're trying to do. Others? Or Commissioner Gonzalez, back to you for, okay. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for that question, Commissioner Gonzalez. I think where I'm coming from on it, and so I've got a slightly different perspective, I think, is that there does need to be, a fairly hard setback because of findings that determine that there's potential public health and or public welfare impacts from oil and gas operations to residents, and that distance is one important tool in mitigating, minimizing, or avoiding those impacts. And however, I'm also believe that if a private property holder wants to consent to, expose themselves to those impacts, that they can have the right to do that. And that's where my concept of the exception comes into play, because it does indicate to me that, in my opinion, there is a hard setback, but a private property owner, resident, or residents, and so I don't want to say it's just the owner, right? Residents, so that would include tenant, has the ability to say, I consent to exposing myself to potential nuisance or welfare issue or public health issue. And then I also think that in any regulatory process, there needs to be a variance consideration, but I think that variance consideration needs to have a high bar as far as how that gets utilized. And so by saying that says that, when you do an analysis, and it could be an alternative location analysis, it could be just a site analysis, it could be a review, it could be that the best site for this particular operation ends up being at 1,950 feet. And we need to be able to have a tool that says that actually is something that we can waive, because even though it doesn't meet the standard of 2,000 feet, it is clearly the most protective location, and it is 50 feet inside of this particular area. And so in our opinion, through a variance process, that this is the best site, and so we will grant this variance. It doesn't have to just be 50 feet. It could be, 350 feet, 400 feet inside of there, but because of the topography of the land, this may actually be less impactful than something that was 2,001 feet away, but is sitting up on top of a hill. And so I think that those are the exceptional circumstances where I would suggest a variance process could be utilized to, a fairly rigid setback standard, but then also understanding that, that setback standard has an exception for residents that choose to provide consent for it to be closer, because they're willingly doing that as a residence within that boundary. And so to me, that actually takes care of a lot of situations that I can anticipate on the Western Slope or in more rural parts of the state, where you do have an operator that wants to put an oil and gas location in a certain area, but there's two residents, within this circumference of the setback, and those two residents are actually supportive of seeing that there, and they're more than willing to provide consent. And so that I think that greatly expands the opportunity to be able to lessen the impacts to operators in more rural parts of the state.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thanks to the commissioners for all of this thoughtful discussion. I guess I am a little bit more along the lines of the idea that the setback that we determine is generally hard. In other words, any operator should be aiming for that distance or beyond, and the exceptions would be rare. And so I appreciate, the question that Commissioner Gonzalez raised and how that all comes into play. Although I think I'm still more compelled by the testimony of the people that have been impacted and thinking about the distance from that perspective. And because the act also now redefines waste in a way that, you know, if mineral resources are unable to be accessed for some reason, if I understand this correctly, and I would look to AAG minor to correct me if I'm misstating this. So in the instances when an operator could not access the mineral resources, given the setback that we've determined, or if we're unable to approve an exception, then that is one of the instances of where we are, you know, we just could not approve. I think there is a lot of opportunity for, you know, the discussion and collaboration in a way that we can let me just step back. I think that the idea that a few people have brought forward today, and I know that we discussed before, of comprehensive planning and those kinds of things, I think can help address some of these things in a more holistic way. And that's going to be useful. So I guess I want to, you know, just kind of continue the discussion from this idea of the distance that we set, to me, should be more of a hard distance with few exceptions. And so what is that right distance from that perspective, and especially if we're all leaning toward from the building unit to the well pad, to the edge of the well pad. And then the other thing that I wanted to note related to that concept of sort of the setbacks being more hard with few exceptions, the school setback, I don't think I mentioned before when I was commenting, but I fully support a 2,000-foot setback from the school property line to the well pad. And I would say maybe we need to consider no exceptions, no waivers in that situation. So I, again, want to just put those two thoughts forward and look to my fellow commissioners for additional discussion.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say that I've been thinking along the same lines for schools as Commissioner Nanjapa, where that is just a hard setback. I'm trying to think of a situation where the variance would be warranted and protective of kids in that area. So I think I would be looking to someone else to give me an example where that I would say that's yes, maybe we do need some sort of an off-ramp for that instead of a hard stop for schools. I really am arguments on both sides here about soft versus the hard setback rule and what distance it should be. And it probably also makes a difference as to how we're defining the distance between X and Y. If it's the building unit itself or the property line and or the edge of the pad or not, because I think that does play into the discussion of the 2,000 feet, 1,500, 500, whatever. And so I think, I'm not sure we can separate that issue from the discussion of the setback number either.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. You were freezing up a little bit. Are you done? I think you're there. Okay. Let me provide some additional perspective on this discussion about hard soft. And I'm influenced in that we create the setback. I still believe 2,000 is right, but that there is an ability for an operator to achieve an off-ramp. And the reason that I say, and so I agree with Commissioner Messner, that first there's the sort of surface owner tenant exception. If everyone within the distance says it's okay and they're willing to say that, you know, sign that, and it's informed consent, so they know what they're saying, that is approvable. But I also liked staff's approach, the language around their setback, which could have been waived upon a showing by the operator that the location continues to be sufficiently protective. And that showing needs to, not only address the health component, with air monitoring or things such as that, but it also needs to be a showing around the nuisance piece as well. I felt that the testimony was compelling there as well. And one of the reasons that I, at least as one commissioner, think that's important is I did director objective criteria permitting for 15 months or so, and I saw on the ground how through smart operator suggesting smart things, how things could be appropriately mitigated to reach the 181 protective level. And I don't want to dismiss, at least me, I would like the off-ramp to try to accommodate that which worked. And so that's why I started 2000 and then build in some waiver language. And Commissioner Messner, I can agree with you that the waiver, it needs to be, sufficiently, doable. But that's where I come in on the soft versus hard, is that I've seen through objective criteria and the use of that on a site-specific basis, operators can indeed suggest methods to be sufficiently protective and sufficiently nuisance mitigative, if that's a word. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And sorry, I'm gonna revisit the diagram that Director Murphy put together for us at the end of the day yesterday. And I want to make sure too that I'm still understanding the 502 variation process, which is two parts. One, which is there's a variance that the director approves and a variance that goes to the commission. And so, am I understanding that correctly? And that the variances that come to the director are those that are able to show equal protection, and maybe AGG minor can help me out with this. And so, to Commissioner Gonzalez's issue or point where we don't want hundreds of variances maybe coming to the commission if it's appropriate for them to be given. It's as protective, and you have those within the setback that we choose all agreeing that the setback is appropriate, that is an off-ramp opportunity with the director, but I'm not sure I'm understanding it correctly. I just want to make sure.
AG Minor or Director Murphy?
I would like to start, and then Joel can help, throw an assist in. What I would like to do is first reshare that slide just so that we all have the benefit of it, right? And it tells me I started screen sharing, but nothing has appeared, so that's pretty special. Oh, there it is. Okay. And what I want to be clear about, Commissioner McGowan, is the slide represents how staff proposed the rules in terms of the 502 variance piece. And as drafted in August, staff had suggested that there would be a director level variance approval and a commissioner level variance approval. The direction we received from the commission 2 weeks ago on the 500 series, or 10 days ago, to me, staff has kind of taken as the commission wants kind of an ultimate sign off on all variances, period. So the slide is not totally up to date with your directions, but it does mean to me that whether a deviation from a setback is entitled a variance, a waiver, or an exception, it is coming to the 5 commissioners for review. I think once the commissioners settle on a direction to staff on what the distances are, working through how the commission wants to review it, either in a tiered approach or whether through a variance or through a full hearing. Those are the places in which there's opportunity to explore the spectrum of hard versus soft. And that's a hard answer, right? Because I'm telling you, we can do whatever you want.
You saying that we're sending you mixed messages?
No, not at all, actually. No, I
Okay.
think that I didn't articulate well enough that this slide was outdated.
Yeah,
as
thank you for
compared to-
reminding me. But so sorry, we did kind of in the discussion for the 500 series, sorry, if you could remind me again, we had broached the idea of some sort of a consent agenda, but that would still go to the commission so that we could pull something off if it was more controversial than it had first appeared, for example.
Yeah, or the director made a really bad choice. I mean, it is possible that directors do that, right? So I think that, and so, I mean, I'm going to kind of preview where staff is thinking on 500, because I think it helps frame this conversation, is that there's a director, if the director is recommending approval on a ministerial variance, it would go on consent. Anything else comes to the commission more formally. So if that helps frame this bigger question, to me, it would take a long time, I think, for a variance from a setback to be considered ministerial. I mean, maybe we get 10 years down the road and everybody has a good feel for it, but I can tell you, I would be leery of considering that ministerial for quite some time.
I tend to agree, Director Murphy, but I also tend to believe in the fact that as we work through this new regulatory regime, operators are going to gain perspective on what is variable or not, as will commissioners. And so I'll leave it there. AAG Minor, did you want to add anything further to that? You've now disappeared, so maybe not. Hello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I have nothing to add to Director Murphy's substantive comments. I think I'll just remind all the commissioners what you already know, that I am more than happy to help answer your questions and of course provide you staff's perspective on any legal issues, and also of course to remind you, particularly in the course of the deliberations, that Mr. Davenport is the commission's counsel, and we can each weigh in, and I don't think it's likely we would ever give you different answers, but just remember that you can call on him with legal questions as well.
Thank you. That's an appropriate reminder. All right, Commissioner Messner.
So let me just ask this question then of staff. As you're looking at the flow of an application process, and I know that you've proposed a certain thing, and I'm sure and I know that there was very good reasons for proposing that, and so the proposed language would have a waiver process, go through a 510 hearing. Is that still, I mean, having heard the deliberations about this, does that still seem like, in your opinion, the best approach as far as looking at a modification from a setback?
Commissioner, staff has recommended in the language of 604 itself kind of the off-ramp, right, in that for at least 604C, and I should actually probably pull up the exact language. For the building units, right, no working pad surface will be located less than 1,500 feet from 10 or more residential building units or one high occupancy building unit unless the commission finds after a hearing pursuant to Rule 510 that it can be approved. I think that building the expectations around how the commission is going to handle the setbacks question, I prefer building them into the 600 series versus relying on kind of the general variance criteria, given the tenor of the conversation and the nuance, in my mind at least, around what is protective and how do we protect? And if we're controlling emissions, what does that leave on the table in terms of impacts for people? And that to me is it's an incredibly nuanced and incredibly difficult conversation that to me warrants its kind of own consideration as compared to relying on a general 502 process.
I would echo that, at least from my perspective, Commissioner Messner, that makes sense, because whether this commission, I mean, say we've got a specific location and say it's at 1,750 feet to 3 building units and they don't consent, but the operator wants to seek a waiver. Whether and to what extent we may decide to do that waiver shouldn't be looked at in isolation of the overall oil and gas development plan. I think you would look at it, everything at the same time. And so that's the 510 hearing on the actual plan, because it's only as we're looking at all the apples that we're able to determine whether that's sufficiently protective or not, even if it doesn't meet the setback. Whereas the variance is something that for a particular area, we're not going to be able to meet the reclamation standard of reclaiming that side of the hill. And instead, we want to do it differently. They get the variance and then they come in with their application for a specific proposal. At least that's how I think of the waiver versus variance.
No, and I appreciate that. So, I mean, that's a compelling argument, and I appreciate those responses because, like I said, I wasn't hung up on one way or the other. So I think that makes some sense to me.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
This is for Director Murphy. I'm curious how based on what you've seen in the permitting since, call it 2 years ago, a year ago, April 2019, when we've had the director's criteria, how many of the pads that have been permitted have gone through director's criteria, have triggered that? And so that's 500 feet less than the setback that's being proposed today. How much could we expect to see variance hearings on as a percentage of permits that would come into the COGCC? I know I'm asking you to use your crystal ball here, but an estimate would help.
Thank you, Commissioner. And to be clear, your question about the number of permits that have come through objective criteria would be limited to the 1,500 feet criteria, not the other objective. I know we pulled a little bit of data on this recently, but I need to kind of like flip back through and find it. And if you want like super up-to-date info, we can start pulling it right now if you'll give us a bit of time on the 1,500 foot question.
I don't know that I need any exact numbers, but I'm trying to quantify as best we can to a ballpark. Is this half? Is this more than 75%? Is this not going to be very many at all? I want to make sure that I'm thinking about this the right way, because I don't want to be making a problem out of something that's not going to be a problem.
And we're almost at our lunch break, and I don't want Director Murphy to have to hastily answer the question, but maybe if we have other thoughts in the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then we can take a break and give staff a chance to bring back some perspective on that. And I'm just throwing that out there for size. I can continue to work through this. Commissioner Messner.
No, I think that's a good plan, because I'm actually curious about these that information as well. Although I think it's important to note that at some point, and I don't remember the date, that objective criteria setback went from 1,500 to 2,000 feet after the CDPHE study was released. So.
Other thoughts before we take a break? I really appreciate the discussion. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you. The only other thing I wanted to just make sure that we revisit is something that Commissioner Gonzalez raised with respect to how we then tie these distances to the 300 series and the alternate location analysis. And, per his comments, and Commissioner Gonzalez, I don't want to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that if we're thinking of these setbacks in the 600 series as the baseline, the hard, line that you want to aim for, the ALA comes into play, and in certain instances, and in those instances could be greater. Is that, first want to make sure that I understood that correctly from Commissioner Gonzalez, but I wanted to make sure that we save some space for that conversation after lunch.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. I'll clear that up just a tad. I guess what I'm getting at is that if we have setbacks that are going to require a hearing, if we're sitting here and I'm a responsible commissioner, I'm going to want to know what that alternative location was anyways, right? And I'm going to ask a bunch of other questions about why you're violating the setbacks, because those are important, and they should be important. And so if I think about it that way, I guess really if I'm bottom line that question, Commissioner Nanjapa, and I don't want to be too flippant here, but what's the point of an alternative location analysis if it's the same footages of setbacks? I'm just having a hard time reconciling the purpose of those two things. And that's what I was getting at with my comments this morning, and transitioning into my suggestion that perhaps, to best protect and minimize adverse impacts, that we take on that alternative location analysis in with more of a reasonable view for, hey, is this permit protective of public health, welfare, safety, the environment, wildlife resources? And you do that by looking at what the other options are. And if there's no other options and it still violates it, then we've got to take a hard look at whether or not that should be permitted or not.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa and Commissioner Gonzalez, for those thoughts. Any other thoughts before we take our 1 hour lunch break? All right, saying none, let's take a break and let's return at 1 p.m. for further deliberations. Thank everyone for the good work this morning.